Okay. Okay, looks okay.
Sarah, I'm recording it.
Okay, super.
Uh, Okay, all right. So I hope that everybody can see the screen. I'm just going to do a little bit of a intervention here. Wait a minute. Just moving things around a bit. There we go. Okay, is everybody able to see the screen? Let's see. There we go. That's the cover. Okay, I know you're muted, but I hope everybody can see. And if you have any problem seeing, please let Sarah know. Okay, as I said, it's a pleasure to see so many familiar faces in the during the service and a little bit afterwards. I've spent a lot of time at OHIV. I've come to services there and I've taught many classes. So I know many people and I know many of you from all kinds of other places too. So it's really a pleasure to see you all. And I hope we'll have a nice 4 sessions together. So this course I've entitled American Jews and Social Justice, Historical Perspectives. And, you know, it's become even more relevant now than it was when I first designed the course. I've been collecting material on American Jews and social justice for a long time, doing research and, you know, hoping to publish some material about it. But the issues were always very relevant and meaningful. And in the last, I would say, you know, year, have become even more meaningful because we're living in very turbulent, challenging times, as I'm sure we'll all agree. We're dealing with political turmoil, a major public health crisis, economic hardship, racial reckoning, and debates about immigration policy. So, you know, a lot of the issues that we'll be talking about in this course are issues that are always with us, but especially with us in a very highlighted way over the past year. And when we talk about social justice, just want to give you a little bit of a working definition. You know, we can come up with all different kinds of definitions. Every one of us, I think, can come up with a definition. But here's one that I think works in most cases. Efforts to create a society or institution based on principles of equality that values human rights and recognizes the dignity of all human beings. So that's a kind of very broad, overarching definition. As I said, we could add a great deal to it depending on our individual perspectives. And social justice work involves includes all of the following causes, among many others. So civil rights, racial justice, labor issues, anti-poverty work, consumer rights, healthcare, food justice, women's or gender or LGBTQ rights, immigration, legal rights, education, environmental activism, and peace efforts. So that's a pretty comprehensive list, but I'm sure, again, we could all add to it of causes that we identify as social justice causes. What I'd like to do in this course is I have a kind of a biographical approach. Rather than talk about the movements themselves, although I will give some historical background on the various movements, what I'm focusing on in this 4-part course is American Jews who have been involved in many of the social justice movements in the United States. And we're going to be talking about specific individuals because I think an individual approach always is something that resonates for us even more than if we talk about, let's say, a movement in general. So we'll be focusing on specific individuals, some of whom may be very familiar to you and some of whom may be new for you. I'm hoping that you will find their stories and their contributions inspirational. They're very inspirational to me. And we'll be reading selections from their writings, very short selections because you know, we can't look at anything too long, but you'll be able to see on the PowerPoint some excerpts from their writings. And I've also on the PowerPoint given you the sources. So if you would like to read more about any of these individuals, you can certainly jot down the source, and much of this is readily available. So I think it's always better to read what these people said in their own words, and they express it much better than I could. And I think you'll find their words to be very inspirational. And again, even the people that we'll be talking about that go back to the mid-19th century, the mid to late 19th century, I think you'll find that their words are still very inspirational for us today. So these are the questions we'll be asking about these individuals. What motivated this person? To what extent was this individual inspired by traditional Jewish values, texts, and sensibilities? And to what extent by influences beyond the Jewish community? This is a big issue that I have encountered in my research. That is, we have many Jews who've been involved in social justice movements, but some of them have been involved because of their Jewishness. In other words, they're very well aware that it's their Jewish identity that has motivated them to become involved in, let's say, the women's movement or the labor movement or any other social justice cause, civil rights movement. But there are other people who got involved in these movements and didn't necessarily connect it with anything Jewish, anything in their Jewish background. And some of them actually even distanced themselves from their Jewish background. So, you know, there's a whole variety of ways that people have thought about their Jewishness and whether or not their Jewishness motivated them. For some people, it was their family background. Their parents had been involved in a variety of movements, and so that inspired them or encouraged them to do so as well. And for some, they didn't have much of a sense of their Jewishness early on, but somewhere later on in their lives, they became aware, oh, my Jewish identity or my Jewish education or my Jewish experiences as a Jew did play a role in my activism. So people have different relationships to their Judaism and connections that they make between their Judaism and activism. Another question we might look at is, how did this person act on his or her ideals? Obviously, how did the individual balance commitments to specifically Jewish and general causes? Some of these people were involved very much in the Jewish community, as well as general social justice work, and some were involved mainly in the larger community and not so much in the Jewish community, and vice versa. So that's an interesting question that will come up. What challenges did this person face? Many of them faced significant challenges. What were this person's accomplishments? What impact did he or she have on American society? How did this person evaluate his or her achievements? What can we learn from this person's life and work? And here's a big question. Why have so many Jews been drawn to social justice causes in America? And we know that Jews have been disproportionately represented in social justice causes in America. And when I say that, that's not to say that all American Jews have supported social justice causes. Some of them have been opposed to one movement or another for various reasons, maybe for political or ideological reasons, or maybe because they felt that the movement would threaten Jews in some way or could be dangerous for Jews. In some cases, Jews felt that they should prioritize Jewish needs over the needs of other Americans. So when we say that Jews have been disproportionately represented in social justice movements, we know that there were some Jews who opposed various movements, such as the civil rights movement. Some Jews did not feel Jews should be getting so involved in the civil rights movement. So it wasn't a foregone conclusion that Jews are involved in this. And then there were some Jews, like everybody else, who were indifferent to many of these movements or just not involved for a whole variety of reasons. But it's still true that Jews have been disproportionately represented in many of these movements. And then people wonder why that is. So here's the famous quote, Tzedek, Tzedek tirdof, justice, justice shall you pursue, Deuteronomy 16:20. And it is cited by many people, many social justice activists. For example, Rabbi Stephen Wise talked about it. former Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg talked about it, which we'll see her quote about it. So this has motivated many Jews to become involved in social justice movements, and many people do mention that this particular verse has been inspirational to them. So some people would say that when we think about why have Jews become involved in social justice movements, some people will say, well, it's because of Jewish law. You know, we can all find in our Torah, in Mishnah, in Talmud, many statements, many injunctions for Jews to be involved in a variety of ways to take care of the poor, to take care of widows, orphans, etc. Anybody who is any of the vulnerable members of society. So there's loads and loads of mention in Jewish law for us to take care of each other and to take care specifically of those who are on the margins, who need our help. Many people cite the prophetic tradition, that is the writings of the Hebrew prophets, and how the prophets have really inspired many of us to get involved in social justice movements. You know, it's no coincidence that we read a section from Isaiah on Yom Kippur, which is a section that discusses the fact that it's not enough just to fast on Yom Kippur, that if you really want to make the fast meaningful, what you should be doing is sharing your food with the hungry and clothing the people who don't have clothes. So that's why many synagogues have instituted the practice of bringing food to the synagogue prior to Kol Nidre, because that's the a message of that very important passage from Isaiah that we read in the Haftarah for Yom Kippur. So the biblical prophets have inspired many Jewish social activists, and we're going to talk specifically about one of them a little bit later this evening, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who said that the prophets were a tremendous inspiration for him in his social justice work. So there are obviously, you know, the various aspects of Jewish law that say, let's take care of the needy, the prophetic tradition, and other people who have analyzed the situation have said, well, we also have a Jewish messianic vision. We have a vision of a better time. And that has inspired many people to think about how can we help to work toward that better time. That's another explanation that's often given. And of course, a key explanation that's given for why have so many Jews gotten involved is, I'm not going to go here yet, is that it's the Jewish historical experience. You know, we've had an experience of marginality. We've had experiences of persecution. Therefore, that has sensitized us to looking out for other people who are experiencing something similar. And that's why you had so many Jews who were represented in when the immigration of various groups was being threatened in the United States. Many Jews went to support immigrants, because we all know, you know, many of our families, many of the people in our families were immigrants. Perhaps we were immigrants ourselves. And so we have a greater sensitivity to the needs of other people who are seeking refuge. And finally, some people say, well, it's in Jewish self-interest to actually look out for other marginal groups in society, because we can ally with each other, we can help each other out. And that, in fact, is also a very important motivation. So we're going to come back to all of this in our last session, but these are some reasons why many people think Jews have become so involved in social justice movements. And of course, I have here the term tikkun olam, which is, you know, the repair of the world, which is a term that we use a great deal. I would point you toward Rabbi Jill Jacobs' book, There Shall Be No Needy. Rabbi Jacobs is the director of the organization called Truah for human rights, Rabbis for Human Rights. And she has discussed she's in her books are about Jews and social justice and how we can draw inspiration from our Jewish tradition for social justice. And what she explains in There Shall Be No Needy, her first book, is that there's a long history of the term tikkun olam, that it evolved over time, that it was a rabbinic concept, that it developed in Kabbalistic thought, and then became much more widely used beginning in 1950s and especially in the 1970s and 1980s as a kind of a catch-all phrase to include much of our work on behalf of people who need help of various kinds. So we can go back to that, but I don't want to take too much time on it now. So what I wanted to do is this evening as by way of introduction, to talk about a few key figures. We could pick many, many people. There are so many people who we might identify who spoke about the Jewish imperative for social justice. You know, is there a Jewish imperative? And they said, yes, because of our tradition, we really feel that we must speak out on behalf of those who are persecuted, those who need our help. But I picked out a few people, and I thought by way of introduction, I would cite some of their writings about the Jewish imperative for social justice. And then we'll move on to talk about healthcare, because that is one of the most pressing issues of our time. And that'll be our session for this evening. In subsequent sessions, we'll be dealing with the labor movement, with the women's movement, and with racial justice. So the last session will be on racial justice and immigration. So tonight's session is introduction, and we'll be talking about healthcare as well. So I'm sure you recognize Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. He's a very, very well-known figure. He talked a little bit about some of the major points of his biography. He was born in Warsaw, descendant of prominent Hasidic rabbis. He studied in Berlin during the 1930s and was involved in Jewish education of many types of Jewish education in Berlin. He was among the Jews in Germany who was deported by the Nazis to Poland in October 1938. You may know that that's what led up to Kristallnacht, the chain of events that led up to Kristallnacht. But he was, while back in Poland, he taught for a while in Warsaw. And then he was fortunate that he was offered a position at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. And Dr. Julian Morgenstern, the president of Hebrew Union College, deserves a great deal of credit for this. He tried to get visas for refugee scholars to bring people to the United States, which of course would save them. Rabbi Heschel was one of those people. He had developed a reputation, and so Dr. Morgenstern it took him a long time to get the visa, but arranged for him to get a visa to come to the United States. He had a temporary visa to England, and he was there for about 8 months, where he helped establish an Institute for Jewish Learning in London. And then he came in March of 1940, came to the United States. So he taught for 5 years at Hebrew Union College, and then came to Jewish Theological Seminary, where he spent the rest of his career. Rabbi Heschel was known for the many books that he wrote on a whole variety of issues. I'm sure you know many of his books. One of my personal favorites is his book, The Sabbath, which I gave to each of my children before they left home to go to college. But he was famous for many, many of his books. And he was famous for his philosophy and for his teaching, but also for his social action. He was involved in a variety of social justice causes, interfaith dialogue, the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, and the Soviet Jewry movements. Rabbi Heschel wrote his dissertation on the prophets, and he later in the 1960s began to translate his book on the prophets into English and to prepare it for publication in America. And his daughter, Susanna Heschel, wrote about how Rabbi Heschel, as he was preparing his work for publication in English, said that he really had to get involved in the social justice movements of the 1960s because the prophets had inspired him. His work on the prophets had inspired him, and he felt that he had to translate that into action. Susanna Heschel has said about her father that he often said, to be a Jew is not simply to be, but to stand for. And of course, Heschel is very well known for his work on behalf of the civil rights movement. We're going to talk more about that in a later session, in our last session. You know that iconic photograph of Heschel marching with Martin Luther King and other leaders of the civil rights movement. But Rabbi Heschel felt that he was motivated in his work by his work with the prophets. And he gave an interview to Carl Stern. The radio program was called The Eternal Light. And the program was recorded on December 10th, 1972. Very sadly, Rabbi Heschel died only a few weeks later, rather suddenly, at the end of December 1972. And the program was actually aired in February 1973 after his death. So it's very poignant. And you can find the interview online. It's a very, very powerful interview. So I highly recommend looking for it. And in this interview, Rabbi Heschel talked about the prophets and how he felt that the message of the prophets was something that we should heed in our own time, and that meant that should encourage us to get involved in social justice and social action. This is what he said. What's so great about the message of the prophet as a character? I've written a book on the prophets. I've learned from the prophets that I have to be involved in the affairs of man and the affairs of suffering man. One of the saddest things about contemporary life in America is that the prophets are unknown. And this, I'm sorry to say, is a little bit of a disaster. The great examples we need today are the ancient prophets of Israel. The prophets mixed into social political issues. What is the greatest concern in the Bible? Injustice to one's fellow men, bloodshed. What is the greatest dream of the prophets and of the Bible? Peace. So these are excerpts from the interview. As I said, the interview is very powerful and very wide-ranging about Dr. Heschel and his work, especially his social action work. And I would encourage you to look for the whole interview and to hear him talk about it in his own words. I wanted to move on. We're going to talk more about Rabbi Heschel when we get to the session on civil rights. But I wanted to mention another important figure, Al Vorspan. You may have heard of him. He died only a couple of years ago. And Al Vorspan was not a rabbi, but he was a very major leader in the reform movement in America. But he wrote many books that also reached out to people beyond the reform movement. So he's well known throughout the American Jewish community. He had been influenced by the political philosophy of Vice President Hubert Humphrey in Minnesota, and he's best known for the formation of a commission on social action in the Reform Movement's Union of American Hebrew Congregations. He was very active in the commission. He was involved in the civil rights movement. In 1964, he went with 16 Reform rabbis, and they went down to St. Augustine, Florida, because the Reverend Martin Luther King had asked for support there, and they were arrested. And they sent a public letter to the American Jewish community about the importance of the civil rights struggle. So he was one of the religious leaders who was involved, very, very much involved in the civil rights movement. And they advocated for the creation of a religious action center in Washington, which was created in 1961 to lobby Congress on behalf of social action issues. The Religious Action Center still exists and has been an important force in promoting social justice. So as I said, Al Vorspan wrote many books, and here is an excerpt from one of his books that he wrote with Eugene Lippmann called Justice and Judaism. I think it's a very powerful statement about, again, another person who felt that his social justice work came out of his Jewish identity and his Jewish commitments. And here's what he said. He said, a passionate belief and concern for justice for all men is inherent in Judaism. Of course, he means men and women. The noblest expression of this mission is to be found in the writings of the literary prophets of the Bible. Again, an emphasis on the prophets. Judaism rejects the device of passing all responsibility for social problems to God. In Jewish tradition, man is called the co-worker or partner of God in the creation of a better world. Judaism has always insisted that every Jew must bring the ethical insights of the Jewish heritage to bear on the specific social problems of our generation, just as we do to the personal and individual problems of our lives. Jewish tradition has never constricted Judaism solely to the relation between man and God. The relations between man and man were actually placed on an even higher pedestal than those between man and God. Social action is not politics or sociology or economics, though it involves all of them. It is of the essence of religion, certainly of the Jewish religion. Far from being an extraneous area of synagogue life, social action is an integral and essential part of synagogue activity. So here's another example of someone who felt that social action was something that was part and parcel of Judaism and that we should feel called upon to undertake as Jews. And then, of course, I felt we had to include Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she needs no introduction, of course. But here is a quote that I don't know if you've seen by Justice Ginsburg. This was something that she wrote in response to a call. The American Jewish Committee had interviewed a number of leading American Jews and asked them what is important about Judaism to them. And she wrote this piece and gave it initially as a speech to the American Jewish Committee, and these pieces were then published, I believe, in the New York Times, so some of you may have seen them there. And this was published in 1995. Justice Ginsburg here is talking about how her Jewish identity was an important pillar of strength for her in her legal career and in her work as a judge. And she says, laws as protectors of the oppressed, the poor, the loner is evident in the work of my Jewish predecessors on the Supreme Court. The biblical command, justice, justice, shalt thou pursue, is a strand that ties them together. I keep those words on the wall of my chambers as an ever-present reminder of what judges must do that they may thrive. I am a judge born, raised, and proud of being a Jew. The demand for justice runs through the entirety of the Jewish tradition. I hope in my years on the bench of the Supreme Court of the United States, I will have the strength and courage to remain constant in the service of that demand. Again, I think she certainly did that, and she did have a depiction of the biblical verse that we talked about, justice, justice shalt thou pursue, on the walls of her chamber. So I'm going to move on to talk about a specific issue that we're all very preoccupied with these days, which is healthcare. And many of us have been thinking about the 1918 influenza epidemic. It's been mentioned often in the course of the last year as we've been struggling with the COVID-19 epidemic and pandemic, I should say. And so as we've been experiencing this, I've been thinking a lot about Lillian Wald, who many of you may know or have heard of. Lillian Wald was an amazing person, and she was a great American Jewish woman, and I think she can offer us a lot of inspiration in this moment. She is best known for her work on behalf of nursing and public health as you may know, and she played a very key role during the 1918 influenza epidemic in New York. But she was also a person who was involved in a whole variety of progressive era concerns in the late 19th and early 20th century. In fact, the scope of her activities is mind-boggling. She was involved not only in healthcare, but also in the labor movement, anti-militarism, protection of civil liberties. She worked to get to establish playgrounds and parks in urban areas, tenement house reform, racial justice. She was one of quite a few Jews who were involved in the establishment of the NAACP, and she was involved in many other ways to promote racial justice in America. She also supported the rights of immigrants, and we'll talk more about that later in the course. So she was everywhere and worked on behalf of a variety of social justice causes. She was born in Cincinnati, raised in Rochester, New York, graduated from the nursing program at New York Hospital in 1891, and enrolled in Women's Medical College with the goal of becoming a doctor. But she wrote a number of books. She wrote two books. One was the House on Henry Street, which was her first memoir, and then the second memoir was written in the 1930s called Windows on Henry Street, and you'll understand why, what the title, where the title came from shortly. But she wrote about her experiences in her memoir, the House on Henry Street, that when she was at the medical college, she began teaching classes in home nursing for impoverished families. And in 1893, she experienced what she described as her baptism of fire. And she referred to this experience that way throughout her life. Many of us may have had turning points in our life at various times. And this was a turning point in the life of Lillian Wald. She was giving this class, and I'm going to show you the excerpt of how she described what happened to her. So this is from her book, The House on Henry Street. And she said, from the schoolroom where I had been giving a lesson in bed making, a little girl led me one drizzling March morning. She had told me of her sick mother. The child led me over broken roadways. The rain added to the dismal appearance of the streets, intensifying the odors which assailed me from every side. The child led me on through a tenement hallway up into a rear tenement by slimy steps, whose accumulated dirt was augmented that day by the mud of the streets, and finally into the sick room. All the maladjustments of our social and economic relations seemed epitomized in this brief journey and what was found at the end of it. The family of 7 shared their 2 rooms with boarders, and the sick woman lay on a wretched, unclean bed, soiled with a hemorrhage 2 days old. At the end of my ministrations, they, that is the family members, kissed my hands. That morning's experience was a baptism of fire. Deserted were the laboratory and the academic work of the college. I never returned to them. On my way from the sick room to my comfortable student quarters, my mind was intent on my own responsibility. To my inexperience, it seemed certain that conditions such as these were allowed because people did not know. And for me, there was a challenge to know and to tell. My naive conviction remained that if people knew things, and things meant everything implied in the condition of this family, such horrors would cease to exist. And I rejoiced that I had had a training in the care of the sick that in itself would give me an organic relationship to the neighborhood in which this awakening had come. So this is, one of the most powerful passages in Lillian Wald's book. And it's something that is often quoted because it was as you can see, a very important description of her personal experience, but also I think a challenge to all of us. If we know certain things, we have to tell and we have to act. And that's something that Lillian Wald learned from this experience. She then left the medical college, and she founded the Nurses Settlement on Henry Street in 1893, which later became known as the Henry Street Settlement. I should mention that she received tremendous support for this from the Jewish philanthropist Jacob Schiff, who was her lifelong friend and supporter and mentor. And he helped to create, she and her friend established a settlement known as the Nurses Settlement on Henry Street, which later became a full-fledged settlement house. But you may know that the settlement houses were houses that were established in major American cities. They're actually, the movement started in London. And these were movements to establish houses in poor neighborhoods and immigrant neighborhoods, and young college students and young adults would come and actually live there and provide services for the residents of the neighborhood. So they would provide classes and clubs and orchestras and teach English and civics, and they had playgrounds, and often these settlement houses were meeting places for various organizations in the neighborhood, etc. They also provided clean milk and all kinds of very important services for the people of the neighborhood. And Lillian Wald did not know much about the settlement house movement when she established her Visiting Nurse Society. The visiting nurses were actually people who would go out and serve people in the community, and they did a lot of preventive care and education. It was really a combination of nursing and what we would call today social work and public health. Like, all of that was brought together in the Visiting Nurse Society, and they would serve people on a sliding scale, whatever they could pay, and sometimes they couldn't pay anything. And they would go into into people's homes to provide care, and also to try to do preventive healthcare work so that people would not get sick. So that was the Nurses Settlement. It later became a full settlement, the Henry Street Settlement, and still exists to this day and is serving people in the neighborhood. The population of the Lower East Side has changed significantly, but still serving people in the neighborhood. And I recently went on their website, and they have a whole variety of activities and programs that are serving people during the time of COVID-19 as well. Lillian Wald was associated with the Henry Street Settlement throughout her life, and headed the settlement until she retired in the early 1930s. But in addition to her work with the Henry Street Settlement, she began to work well beyond and to broaden the scope of her activity into the city as a whole, and nationally and even internationally. So she is best known for launching the field of public health nursing. She established the first public school nursing program in the country in 1902. I've been thinking a lot about that lately, because public school nurses are so important during the pandemic now. They are the ones who have to help to implement healthcare policies, to really coordinate all of the various programs that are in place in schools to try to help schools open safely. And so public school nurses are really, really important now and always. And this was an area where Lillian Wald pioneered. She also gave a lecture series in 1910 that led to the establishment of a Department of Nursing and Health at Columbia University's Teachers College. She co-founded and became the first president of the National Organization of Public Health Nursing in 1912. And she played a very, very important role during the 1918 flu epidemic. So this is something that I wanted to highlight because of our situation today. And just to tell you a little bit about what was going on in 1918, there was, when the flu came to the United States in the fall of 1918, there was actually a shortage of nurses because Many nurses had gone to serve in the military field hospitals. And also there was a lot of discrimination against African-American nurses. And so they weren't being utilized as much as they could have been and should have been. So nurses were very, very much needed to help to provide for all of the people who were becoming ill during the epidemic. And here's an example of that. The Philadelphia Health Commissioner, Crewson, said in 1918, if you would ask me the 3 things Philadelphia most needs to conquer the epidemic, I would tell you nurses, more nurses, and yet more nurses. So again, at a time when we're honoring our healthcare professionals for what they're doing, this was something that was very much needed in 1918. And the visiting nurses were especially important because they were able to serve the people in their homes, whether it was in poor urban areas or in rural areas. And so visiting nurses were especially important during the epidemic of 1918. In New York, of course, Lillian Wald had already established a significant infrastructure with the visiting nurses at Henry Street, and they were among the first to respond in 1918. So Lillian Wald wrote to the New York City Health Commissioner to let him know what the nurses were doing during the epidemic. And this was in October of 1918. And she said, our entire staff is nursing influenza and pneumonia cases. We are doing the best that we can. Nobody is hysterical. The supervisors themselves are carrying the bag. And what she meant was literally carrying the bag of their supplies, because these people would often go on foot to visit the various people in their homes. Soon after that communication, the Red Cross's Council established a Nurses Emergency Council to coordinate the work of nursing in New York. This was created by the Red Cross Atlantic Division. And Lillian Wald was appointed chair of the Nurses Emergency Council. So she was in charge of coordinating the response of New York City nurses with hospitals, social work agencies, and religious institutions in response to the epidemic. And one of the things that they did was to organize the volunteers and to try to get many people. Volunteers were helping in a variety of ways. They transported the nurses, they transported their supplies, they helped to provide food, and they raised funds. And so apparently there were a lot of volunteers who were mobilized in order to deal with the epidemic. Lillian Wald also wrote about I don't have this. She wrote about her work during the epidemic. She wrote an article called "When the City is a Great Field Hospital: The Influenza Pandemic of 1918 and the New York City Nursing Response," that was filled with lots of information, data, and charts. And according to Lillian Wald's biographer, Marjorie Feld, the article was, quote, "an urgent plea for socialized healthcare." Wald acted on the idea that everyone, all races, religions, classes, everyone is deserving of care. Caring for one was caring for all of us. Marjorie Feld described Lillian Wald's work during the crisis, and she wrote, "Amid the tremendous suffering of that epidemic, Lillian Wald slept very little, caring for patients and nurses, enlisting volunteers for the work, and appealing to benefactors to fund it." So Wald's work during the epidemic was extremely important. She later, in 1919, was at an international health conference in France, and I don't have this in the PowerPoint, but I'm just going to read you what she wrote at the time, which I think is very relevant to us today. again, she was at an international conference, and there was discussion at the conference of the need for international cooperation with respect to epidemics. And what she said was, quote, "The time must come when all peoples of the world will combine to solve these questions which know no boundaries. Typhus and influenza have no respect for frontiers, and worldwide epidemics must be met by united force." I think those are words that can be very inspirational for us today as we deal with the global pandemic, because she felt that countries should work together, especially when it came to promoting public health. So as I said, Lillian Wald was involved in a whole variety of other progressive era causes. We are going to talk about her work with the NAACP and her other work on behalf of racial justice later in the course. So we will talk about her again. And as she was a big advocate for immigrant rights and all of these other causes that I've listed and that I had mentioned before. So she's a very, very amazing figure. And she was raised, I didn't say too much about her early life, but she was raised in Rochester, and her family were members of the Reform Synagogue, Brit Kodesh, and the rabbi there was very liberal and promoted universalist causes. Her family was not particularly religiously observant, and Lillian Wald had a very universalist outlook on life. So people have often talked about, what was her Jewish identification. She, of course, she never severed her connection to Judaism. She spoke to various Jewish audiences and synagogues and for Jewish organizations. And many of the people that she served at the Henry Street settlement were Jews. It was an immigrant neighborhood, and many of the residents of the neighborhood were Jews. And many of the people who were Lillian Wald's benefactors were Jews, like Jacob Schiff and many of the other leaders of the uptown Jewish community. But she herself had a very universalist viewpoint. So remember, we talked about how social activists had different connections to their Judaism. She had a connection to her Judaism, but she was mostly outer directed and had a kind of a universalist view. We only have a few more minutes before I want to open this up to questions and answers. So I want to, here's a picture of a field hospital in 1918. We've seen some similar scenes today. I just want to say a little bit about another person who might not be quite as familiar to you as Lillian Wald, and this is Frances Stern. She was a pioneer in another area, a health-related area in nutrition. We talked today a lot about food justice and about the fact that people of different income levels and people from various ethnic backgrounds don't necessarily have the same access to food. Certainly, we've seen the long lines, unfortunately, tragically, during the pandemic of people waiting at food banks, people who never had to go to food banks before. Many people are dealing with food insecurity today. And Frances Stern was an important early advocate for nutrition and food, what we would call today food justice. And she worked with poor communities who were struggling with food justice, with access to food. So she was born in Boston to a German Jewish family. She was involved with the Hebrew Industrial School for girls. She taught dietetics to children, and she became involved in the early home economics movement. So she was an assistant to Ellen Richards at the Pratt Institute. And Ellen Richards was a pioneer in the home economics movement that paved the way for the founding of the American Home Economics Association in 1908. But Frances Stern also studied at MIT, very unusual for a woman at the time. She studied chemistry and the sanitation of food. And she became interested in working with poor and undernourished people. She wrote a book called Food for the Worker about the diet of factory workers. And she's best known for her work with the food clinic that was connected to the Boston Dispensary. And the food clinic was a model institution. It became a model for many other similar clinics in the United States and around the world. It was a research center that focused on the connections between health, nutrition, class, and ethnicity, religion, income, and psychology, psychological factors. So they dealt with all of those kinds of issues, which was true progressive way of doing things. You would do the research and then you would act on it. So they did the research, but they also had people who would come to the clinic for help with various aspects of nutrition. And her clinic became a training facility for hospital dietitians from abroad. By the 1940s, there were 50 such clinics. So she started hers in 1918, and it became a model for many other similar clinics. In 1943, it was renamed the Frances Stern Nutrition Center at Tufts University, and it still exists. You can find it if you Google, you'll find a nice write-up about the center. Frances Stern said the following: rightly, nutrition can be called the first line of defense, and the dietitian is necessary wherever there is concern for the health and happiness of human beings. The science of nutrition must be applied through education, reaching into every home, including those of wealth and poverty, and in innumerable ways making a finer, stronger nation. So I think it's worth remembering Frances Stern's contributions at a time when we talk a lot about food justice, and there are people who are struggling with food insecurity today. And she was an early advocate for people who were struggling financially and were having difficulty getting access to food and getting access to proper nutrition. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to end my share so that I can see you. Just one moment. Having a little trouble finding the, let's see. I'm going to try to stop the share, but I'm not able to, not doing it that easily. Oh, I see why. Okay, one moment. Oh, okay, there we go. Okay, so I'd like to open this up. Sarah, I think you have some of the questions, please.
I am looking. I don't have a question yet.
Okay.
Okay, Rabbi.
I think Rabbi Perlstein has a question.
Yes. Go ahead, Rabbi. Unmute yourself.
Yes. So, Rena, this may sound like a political question, but I don't mean at all to ask it politically, but academically and from your scholarship. So, as I'm watching you talk about Lillian Ward, so I've always felt that my approach to religion and Judaism is very similar to my approach to how I see the world in domestic issues in the United States, right? They go hand in hand as far as I'm concerned. So here you're giving a class and you're showing us a person who really took a progressive view of life and lived that way, Lillian Wald. So my question is, Rena, if you wanted to do a couple of sessions on the great Jews who took a very conservative approach to life, fill sessions with that? Or do these folks speak to who we were at that time? Because I'm kind of like feeling like these were the people that I learned about And so I said, growing up Jewish, that's how I want to be too. So does that question make any sense?
I'm sorry, I missed one little, the sound wasn't good for one sentence that you said. So can you rephrase the question, please? Because we missed one critical sentence and everybody, people are nodding.
I wish I knew what it was. So
I-
I'll tell you. So Lillian Ward seems to me to be the role model
Right,
of how we can be as
Mhm.
Jews, which is a very progressive approach to life. I mean,
right.
what she was doing then would fit in, well today. My question is, are there major Jewish personalities that one could talk about that took a different approach? What would today be considered a very conservative approach
Hmm.
to life and domestic policy?
Okay. Yeah, I have to think about that because most of, certainly there are. I mean, one of the things I said at the beginning is that most of my research has been focused on social justice activists. And most of those were, progressive, whether Lillian Ward was a progressive with a capital P, right? Involved with progressive era reform. But most of the people that I have studied are people who were involved in, I would say, were liberal to radical on the political spectrum. But as I said at the beginning, Jews have been always found on all points of the political spectrum, and that there were Jews who did not support some of these social justice initiatives for a variety of reasons, for political reasons, for ideological reasons. So what I said at the beginning of the session is that Jews have been disproportionately represented in movements for social justice, which tend to be on the liberal to the left wing of the spectrum. But there were always Jews who opposed those movements, or who either opposed or were indifferent to, and did so for a variety of reasons. So they did it either because politically they didn't agree, or because, in general, or because they felt that getting involved in these movements could somehow endanger Jews. So that was certainly true of many Jews who lived in the South during the civil rights movement in the 1960s. There were some very courageous Jews in the South who spoke out, including many rabbis, as we know, who spoke out on behalf of civil rights. But there were many Jews in the South who were concerned, whatever their personal feelings were about civil rights, they were very worried about speaking out on behalf of civil rights because it was dangerous. Jewish institutions were being bombed, and or being threatened to be bombed, and it was a very scary time. So sometimes people Jews didn't support these movements because of concerns about their own safety, or else concerns, in some cases, concerns, and here would be an example, I think, of some of the folks who were involved with, some of the more right-wing Jewish groups of, let's say, the 1970s, were very concerned that being involved in whether it was civil rights or other progressive causes would take Jews away from pressing Jewish concerns. In other words, that Jewish concerns should be prioritized over some of these other issues. So I'm not going to point to individuals, but I think we all know what some of the groups were, that there were groups that said, well, we can't get involved in these issues because we have to prioritize Jewish issues. And in some cases, there were conflicts of interest, right? If you're going to support affirmative action, that could work against Jewish interests, some people thought. So that's an example that there were always Jews who, for a variety of reasons, didn't support these or didn't support certain movements. They might have supported some, but not others. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, at this time, we don't have any other questions. I want to remind that the next session is going to be in February 11th, and Rena is going to talk about the women's movement and gender rights. Okay, we have two people raised hands. I don't see them. Oh, Sherry? Go ahead, Sherry.
Would be interested in a little bit of backstory on Lillian Wald. In World of Our Fathers, Irving Howe makes a big point that he doesn't understand why Schiff demanded full bookkeeping from Lillian Wald. And that is a culture conflict between German Jews and Eastern European Jews. My grandfather, who was a lawyer, when I went to college, there was a small fund, but he insisted on complete accounts for me.
Mhm.
And that is just, he would not go to sleep at night until he accounted for every penny that he had the day before. It wasn't a matter of spending money. It was that you kept track of your money and you understood where it went and how it went. And that's the same mentality that Schiff gave to Wald, and I'm sure Wald understood it completely.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, the relationship between the two of them was very interesting, and mutually supportive. Yeah, I mean, he was a tremendous financial support to her. And not only that, but also, you know, he had Jewish knowledge. Lillian Wald did not have any Jewish education, which is, you know, kind of a shame, even though her family belonged to a synagogue. But Jacob Schiff did have a lot of Jewish background, and so he shared that with her. And then she also helped him to meet some of the folks on the Lower East Side, and he was very interested in providing support and help for people. But she helped him to introduce him to some of the people who were doing, some of the residents of the Lower East Side and the people who were organizing on the Lower East Side. So they had a very interesting and mutually beneficial relationship and close personal relationship. But that's an interesting point. Thank you. But there was another hand up, I think.
Yes, Mimi. Mimi?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Nice seeing you again, Dr. Rena. It's very, very nice being in your class. I always enjoyed your classes when you came to OHEB, when we were there physically.
Yes.
Classrooms, it was very, very nice. So this is kind of a statement question. Considering the fact that Jews are very much involved in social justice, whether they are brought up with it, no matter how they get it, but somehow Jews are very much involved. What I find quite interesting is the fact that there are many, I'll give you an example. I have a community down in Florida, and there are a lot of Jewish people in the community that I live in. And there are, I think, just about every single Jewish organization that you can imagine. And it's there and it's supported and everyone's active in them. Be it ORT, NCJW, Hadassah, whatever it might be. There's a bevy of organizations. Now, honestly speaking, these are not religious women. These are not religious people. I see by the fact that they don't belong to synagogues. I don't know where they got the background, but they have this yearning to belong to these social justice organizations. I think it's fabulous, but where does that come from?
So they're involved with many organizations that do social justice. Is that-
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
But it has nothing to do with the fact that they might be religious Jews.
Mhm.
So where does that come from?
Well, you know, it's very interesting. You know, as we talked a little bit about at the beginning, you know, I've been studying a lot of these people, and it's very interesting because people have different the social justice activists, whether they work, some of them work through Jewish organizations, and some of them work through general organizations. And of course, the Jewish organizations often serve Jews, but also serve many other people as well, as you pointed out. And that was always the case, and it's true today too. But and as you know, there are a whole variety of social justice organizations, Jewish organizations that have sprouted up in recent years. But what I find interesting is to kind of look at some of the people from the past, and we talked about a few of them, and how they related to their Jewishness in connection with their social justice, right? So some people said that they were, that they felt they got involved, that their Jewishness just impelled them to get involved in social justice. So, for example, I'll just give you a few examples. So Stephen Wise, Rabbi Stephen Wise, who was a big social justice advocate, a major reform rabbi, said at one point, one of his statements was, "For me, the supreme declaration of our Hebrew Bible was and remains, justice, justice shalt thou pursue." And of course, he was very involved in the Jewish world throughout his life as a rabbi, as a leader of the Jewish community, including during the Holocaust years, a leader of the American Jewish Congress and the World Jewish Congress, but he was also involved in a whole variety of social justice causes. So that's kind of one example of, there were a number of Jewish activists who were throughout their lives involved in Jewish causes and social justice, general social justice causes. And that was sort of one stream. We're going to be talking about Maud Nathan, who was a most famous Jewish suffragist. And she was also like that. She was very involved in the Jewish world, but also very involved in social justice activities. And then you have social justice activists who weren't involved at all with the Jewish community. And they didn't have any particular connection. Some of them became more involved in the Jewish community later. But I have there's an interesting discussion about Jews, for example, who were involved in the civil rights movement. So some of them came to civil rights because of their Jewish background, like Abraham Joshua Heschel is a very good example. Some of them came to their involvement in civil rights because they had been raised in refugee families that had survived the Holocaust. And so they felt that they had an obligation to help people who needed help, because they felt that some people should have stepped up more to help people during the Holocaust, and they had experienced this persecution themselves. They felt they had to reach out to others. So some people got involved in the civil rights movement for that reason. And then some people may have been, there were some people in the civil rights, and Abraham Joshua Heschel often lamented the fact that many Jews who got involved in the civil rights movement did not do so out of a sense of Jewish obligation, that they did it for other general ethical reasons, but not necessarily because they were Jews. But this, I'm finally getting to the answer to your question. But Sidney Schwartz, who has also written about Jews and the civil rights movement, said the following. He said, most American Jews, basically what he was saying is that there were civil rights activists who may have been motivated by Jewish values, cultural, and historical experience, even if they did not recognize or acknowledge that connection. That he felt that there was something in them that impelled them to do this, even if they didn't recognize it as a Jewish motivation. And this is what he said. He said, most American Jews had a personal story in which persecution and oppression were not more than a generation behind them. They had a cultural instinct for acting on a situation that was morally reprehensible and patently unjust. And then he went on to say, it is undoubtedly true that few of the Jewish civil rights activists, with the exception of a handful of rabbis, were motivated by the religious principles of the Torah. Yet social justice principles are often internalized by Jews, whether or not they ever sat at the feet of a Jewish educator. For Jews, the principle of deen, justice, and fairness became part of their folk culture, conveyed by parents to their children in the way they saw and experienced the world. So, I mean, that's his theory. I don't know if it's necessarily the case, but that's his theory, is that, whether or not people are religiously involved, or whether or not they are even Jewishly involved. The people you're describing clearly are involved Jewishly because they're getting involved in Jewish organizations. But some people get involved in social justice, some Jews get involved in social justice causes and never work through a Jewish organization, and certainly don't see themselves as being propelled religiously to do it.
Yeah.
But Sidney Schwartz has he has a theory that somehow it's in them. That this experience, their historical experience as it was passed down through the generations is in them and impels them to get involved.
Which is really quite a plausible answer when you think about it, that it just does come down like Lador Vador. It comes down through the generations. It's something that my parents and grandparents may have been involved in, and maybe I should be doing the same thing. Yeah, it probably is the case.
Right.
So thank you.
You're welcome.
Marvin?
Marvin,
Yeah. You can say that one of the means of democracy is to take from me and give it to them. In the 50s, that worked pretty well because I was part of them. Society was homogenous. It's not homogenous anymore. I've taken the 7 subway in New York City, and you can see how diverse this country now is. That means essentially there's not one point of view, there's probably infinite. You can't categorize justice anymore by simple laws like you find in the Torah. Justice has to be educated almost one by one because there's so many different manifestations of problems.
Mhm.
The problem that I see, it has to do with what is justice nowadays? Do you find that justice is the same justice that it used to be, or is it a new brand?
well, I think that's a very good question, and there's no definite answer. I think it's true that this is something that is can be defined differently by every person. And the term is thrown around a lot these days, right? It's used a lot, and a kind of a catch-all phrase. And of course, there are many different ways to think about justice, and as you say, like infinite number of ways, depending on who you're talking about. I do think that there's a nice a commentary in the Eitz Chaim Chumash about the verse that I cited at the beginning, the famous verse, Tzedek Tzedek Tirdof, Deuteronomy 16:20. And the Eitz Chaim Chumash, I think, says it very nicely in the commentary. You can look it up, page 1089. Says, this verse is the classical source of the Jewish tradition's demand that we advocate and practice both formal and distributive justice in our interpersonal relations and in society at large. That is, we must judge people using fair procedures, that's formal justice, and we must ensure that everyone gets at least the minimum of what is necessary to live, distributive justice. I thought that was an interesting commentary in the broadest possible understanding of justice. But I think your point is very well taken, Marvin. There are lots of different ways of understanding justice, and we do live in a very diverse society now. And it means different things to different people.
With that, I think we will conclude this evening.
Sarah, there's one more person. Is it Denise?
Yes, it
I'm
is.
sorry, I didn't see.
I
the-
have just a quick one. You'll probably know right away. But when I was a child, there were a great many juvenile biographies about Jane Addams, who admittedly did very fine work. But I had never heard of Lillian Wald until I was in college or maybe even out of college. And to your knowledge, is she being taught at all in the schools today, elementary schools, or in religious schools, Jewish religious schools? Because I think she was a fabulous woman.
Well, I certainly hope so. And it's interesting that her biographer, Marjorie Feld, mentioned that she does talk about the comparison with Jane Addams, that Jane Addams is much better known. Jane Addams had founded Hull House, the settlement house, very, very famous settlement house in Chicago in 1889. And actually, Lillian Wald did not know about what Jane Addams had done when she established her own settlement, the nurses settlement, which later became the Henry Street settlement. She met Jane Addams later, of course, and they were very close as part of the settlement house movement, and were aligned on many issues. But Lillian Wald's biographer, Marjorie Fell, does point out that Lillian Wald doesn't get as much play as Jane Addams, in part because Jane Addams wrote more, she was more internationally known, but Lillian Wald did have an international reputation. And it's very important, even before a lot of people have been talking, I mean, not a lot, some of us have been talking about her during the pandemic. But there is some new research that's come out, a book that came out about the Henry Street settlement recently. That was based, it was I think the 125th anniversary of the settlement. And there was an exhibit, and then out of that came a book. And there's I've just seen a very nice video of it. I'm gonna see if I can find that quickly. I did put it aside here to mention to you. Let me see if I can locate it quickly. Yes. The book that was written by Ellen Snyder Grenier, Grenier, which was about the Henry Street settlement. And there's a video that you might be able to access online. I'm not sure I was able to find it. Taking Action in Time of Need, Lillian Wald, Henry Street Settlement, and the Lower East Side, which is a very nice, this was the person who had put together the exhibition. And so there's a lot of great photographs and artifacts that she has about the Henry Street settlement. And we've touched on some of the points that she raises as well. But, a lot of this happened before the pandemic. I think the exhibit was like 2018 or thereabouts. But since the pandemic, I've certainly been talking about Lillian Wald, and I think that some other historians have as well. You may know that Pamela Nadell is just a very well-known American Jewish historian, just came out with a book on American Jewish women. And she's spoken about Lillian Wald as well. So it's, I think people are rediscovering Lillian Wald, but in fact, when I've mentioned her recently, someone told me that even in the nursing school, when she went to nursing school, that Lillian Wald has been, is discussed in nursing programs. So the nursing program that she started at Columbia University is a thriving program these days, nursing and public health. And Lillian Wald is still taught. So I think in those settings, yes, but she certainly deserves to be better known.
Right. Well, I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Sure.
Thank you very much, Rena.
My pleasure. It's great to see you all. And I
Thank
think
you.
I think next week is next Thursday. It's a Thursday, right? February 11th is a Thursday.
I believe so. I'm checking.
February 11th, right.
And I think we're talking about the labor movement, right?
I heard second labor movement, yes, so it was my mistake. I jumped to the third when I announced it. Yes, you are right. The labor movement next week, next session.
Yeah.
Yes, it'll be the labor movement, and also we'll be talking about economic justice. So it'll be a little broader, mostly about the labor movement, but a little broader. Okay?
Wonderful.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Everyone.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.